IV His Honour, the District, Judge a Tale of India by John Le Breton. His Honour Syed Mehta, the District Judge of Golampur, had dined with the Malcolms, and he was the first of the collector's guests to leave the bungalow. He sauntered down the drive, lifting his contemplative gaze to the magnificence of the starry heavens. Behind him, the lamp-lit rooms sent long thrusts of light, swordwise, into the hot darkness. Joan Malcolm had taken up her violin, and the sweet, wailing notes of it came sighing out onto the heavy air. Ruddy, broad-faced young Kappa of the police lounged by the open window, eating her up with adoring eyes. His Honour smoked his cigar tranquilly, but at heart he smouldered. Harrow and Lincoln's Inn backed his past. The high courts awaited him in the future. For the present, he was a civil servant of excellent position and recognized ability, a Mohammedan gentleman who had distinguished himself in England as well as in the land of his birth. Also, he was of less account in the eyes of Joan Malcolm than Kappa, a blundering English acting superintendent of police with a pittance of 600 rupees per mensem. Possibly Kappa had not intended to be offensive, but it is not given to the young and the British to entirely conceal all consciousness of superiority when speaking with a native. His courtesy was that of a man who considered it to be beneath his dignity to use less ceremony. His civility was due to his respect for himself, not for the person whom he honored with his unintellectual conversation. The judge flipped the ash off his cigar, and his slender hand was cool and leisurely. His dark, straight-featured face was impassive as carven stone. Mentally, he was cursing Kappa with curses of inexhaustible fire and venom. Malcolm the collector had a right to speak loudly, and to say this or that without cause, for he was collector. But Kappa, a mere superintendent of the police, a cub of 23, was on a very different footing. Yet, not even as an equal had he borne himself toward a district judge. His Honour's bungalow was on the outskirts of the town, and as he paced along the dusty road, he came to a footpath that ran down the hill, through dense jungle, to the native village in the valley. There was a swarm of dark-skinned fellowmen down there, to whom his name stood for all that is highest in authority. They would have loaded him with gifts had he permitted them to approach him. To them, it seemed that he was placed far above as a god, holding their lives and their fate twixt finger and thumb in mid-air. In the unfathomed depths of the judge's educated, well-ordered mind stirred a craving for solace. Galled by the brutish indifference of the Englishman, there was yet left to him the reverence of his own people. He looked sharply up and down the road before he dived into the moist heat beneath the trees. He knew all that he was risking for a mere escapade. He had never trodden that path before, excepting when he had gone on a shooting expedition with the collector. There were strange noises in the darkness, stealthy rustlings, small, unfamiliar cries. He heard nothing but Kappa's comment on his carefully reasoned prediction that the day must come when India would govern herself. "Oh, you think so?" Stupid, unmeaning, absurd, but successful. Then, immediately Kappa was talking to Miss Malcolm about tennis, and she was listening, smiling and intent. The judge was a crack tennis player. He loathed the game, but he had made himself proficient in it, because it is one of the things that people expect of a man. He was impelled to challenge Kappa, and the answer was a drawled excuse. The judge was well down the hill now, descending the last precipitous slope, and the countless odours of the Indian village rose to his nostrils. There was a dull, murmurous commotion afar off, such as bees make when they are hiving. He listened without curiosity as he pressed forward. Suddenly he halted. The murmur boomed out into a long, thunderous roar. Then silence, and out of the silence a single voice, deep and ringing. "An infernal protest meeting," the judge's British training informed him. He went forward again, moving noiselessly, and reached the outskirts of the crowd, sheltering himself between the bushes that fringed the jungle. Torches flared and smoked and shed a ruddy, uncertain light on hundreds of rapt, upturned faces. The orator stood tall and straight above them, fully revealed by purposely clustered lights. He volleyed reproach and insult upon his listeners. He gave them taunts instead of persuasion. They stood enthralled by the passionate voice, and bitter words found their mark and rankled poisonously. "These Soors of Feringi, whom you call your masters, beat you, and they use your brothers to be their sticks. But for your brothers, who wear the uniform of the Feringi and carry their guns, these worthless masters would be trodden into the dust beneath your feet. The men who hedge them in with steel must turn that steel against them." The roar of voices thundered among the trees and died away suddenly, so that no word from the speaker might be lost. "They are cunning, these Feringi, my brothers. They steal the wisest from among us while yet they are children, and bear them away to their own land, and give them over to their own teachers. Thus come back your own, with power and authority to scourge you. Your sons, your brothers come back to you, learned, praised greatly, having striven against the Feringi in their own schools, and won what they desired. Collector Sahib, Judge Sahib, yea, even Padre Sahib, come they back to you, not to lift you to honor and happiness beside them, but to side with those that oppress you, to grind taxes from you who starve, to imprison you who would be free. Sons of unspeakable shame. They drink your blood, they fatten on your misery, and they have their reward. We curse them, brothers. The Feringis smile upon them. They eat bread and salt in their company, but they spit when they have passed by. Something in the scornful voice rang familiarly on the judge's ears, and incautiously he changed his position and tried to get a clearer view of the treasonmonger. Instantly the man's bare brown arm shot out and pointed him to public notice. "Here is one," pealed out the trumpet voice. "Has he come as our brother? Or comes he as the slave of our masters to spy upon our meetings, and to deal out punishment to those who dare to be free? O brother, do you walk to Calcutta, where the high courts be, over our bodies and the bodies of our children? Will you go to the Collector Sahib with tales of a native rising and call up our brothers of the police to kill and maim us? Or come you to offer us a great heart?" The judge stood there, a motionless figure, flaring against the dark jungle in his spotless white linen evening dress. There was a broad silk cummerband about his lean waist, and a gold signet ring gleamed on his left hand. Half a dozen Englishmen, thread for thread in similar garb, still lounged in the collector's drawing-room. He appeared the very symbol of anglicized India. The brown, half-naked mob surged and struggled to look at him. The brown, half-naked orator still pointed at him and waited for reply. Meanwhile, he had been recognized. "Iswar Chandra, by Jove!" muttered the judge. The last time they had met was in a London drawing-room. Iswar Chandra, the brilliant young barrister at law, had discoursed to a philanthropic peeress upon the social future of his native land, whilst an admiring circle of auditors hung upon his words. The fate of India's women, he had said, lay at the feet of such fair and noble ladies as Her Grace. The judge remembered that people were saying that evening of Iswar Chandra that he was a fascinating and earnest man, and that he would be the pioneer of great things in the country of his birth. The eyes of the half-naked savage challenged the judge over the sea of moving heads and drove away the supercilious smile from his lips. "Brother, we claim you. You are of our blood, and we need such as you to lead us. The Ferengi have sharpened a sword to cut us down, but it shall turn to destroy them. Brother, we suffer the torments of hell. Will you deliver us? Brother, we starve. Will you give us food? Will you deal out to us life or death, you whose fathers were as our fathers? Choose now between great honor and the infamy that dies not. You are the paid creature of the British Raj, or you are a leader of free men. Brother, speak. As in a dream, the judge approached the waiting crowd. His mouth was parched, his heart beat fitfully. He wanted that piercing voice to wake the echoes again, to take up the story of the old blood feud, to goad him into doing that which he had not the courage to do. Vanished was his pride of intellect, and of fine achievement. He was a native, and he tugged and crawled at the stretch of the British chain. The Ferengi are few, and we are many. Shall the few rule the many? Shall we be servants and poor, while yet in the arms of our own golden mother? In their own country do the Ferengi not say that the word of the majority shall be law? So be it. We accept their word. The majority shall rule. O brother, skilled in the Ferengi craft, high-placed to administer justice to all who are brought before thee, do I not speak the truth? The judge threw away the dead end of his cigar and shouldered his way into the inmost circle. Peace thou, he said thickly, this is folly. Ye must wait a while for vengeance. Chandra threw up his arms, writhing in a very ecstasy of fury. We have waited. Have we not waited? Beside our open graves. Death to the Ferengi. Let them no longer desecrate our land. Let us forget that they ever were. They be few, and we be many. Brothers, tonight. The judge was tearing off his clothes. He was trampling them beneath his feet. He was crying out in a strange, raucous voice. And all the swaying crowds were taking up his words, maddening themselves and their fellows with the intoxicating sounds. Death to the Ferengi. Tonight! Tonight! Our land for ourselves. All but a few torches were extinguished. Secret places were torn up, and out came old guns, old swords sharpened to razor-like edges, great pistols, clubs, skinning knives, daggers. Then, up and up through the dark jungle they thronged, hordes of them in the grip of a red and silent frenzy. Chandra was in the forefront, but the leader was his honor, the district judge, a glassy-eyed, tight-lipped Mussulman in a loincloth and a greasy turban. The lights of the collector's bungalow came in view, and the leader thought of young Kappa and rushed on, frothing like a madman, waving his sword above his head. Then he paused and ran back to meet the laggards of a yard or two. "Only the men!" he shouted. Chandra mocked at him as the press bore him onward again, with scarcely an instant's halt. "Only the men, my brother," he echoed. A few of the native police stood guard at the collector's gates, but they turned and fled before the overwhelming numbers of the attacking force. Up the long drive the dark wave poured, and into the wide, bright rooms. The bungalow was deserted. Some fleet-footed servant had brought warning in time, and the British were well out of the town by the other road, with young Kappa and a score of his men guarding their rear. The mob howled with disappointment. The next instant it was screaming with triumph as it settled down to sack and burn and destroy. The judge went into the dining room and looked at the long table still decked with silver and glass and flowers. He looked at the chair on which he had sat with Joan Malcolm at his side, and he picked it up and dashed it with all his might into a great ivory-framed mirror, and laughed aloud at the crash, and the ruin, and the rain of jagged splinters. India must pass into the hands of the Indians. Oh, you think so? You think so? You think so? See? He overthrew a couple of standard lamps and watched the liquid fire run and eat up their silken shades, and run again and leap upon the snowy curtains, and so, like lightning, spring to the ceiling and lick the dry rafters with 1,000 darting tongues. Then he was out in the night again, the night of his life, the wonderful night that was calling for blood and would not be denied. There was no lack of light now to make clear the path to vengeance. The collector's bungalow roared red to the very heavens, and flames shot up in a dozen different parts of the town. The bazaar was looted, and English-made goods were piled upon bonfires in the street. A greater mob than had entered the town poured out of it, swift on the road to Chinsura, where thousands of their brothers lay, lacking only courage and leaders. At the midway turn of the road, where the giant trees rear themselves at the side of the well, came a sudden check, and the mob fell back upon itself, and grew dead silent. Those in the rear could only wait and guess what had happened. The forefront saw that the road was barred. The moon had risen, and well out in the white light was Kappa Sahib. Some of his men were behind him. There were soldiers there too, how many could not be seen, for they were grouped in the velvety black shadows which the trees flung across the road. There might have been only 50 or 500. Young Kappa came forward with his hands in his pockets and stared at them. They saw that he was not afraid. He spoke to them in Marathi, bluntly and earnestly, so that some of them wavered and looked back. He said they were fools, led by a few rotten schemers who had only personal gain in view. "Take good advice," he said. "Go to your homes while ye may." Ignorant and greatly daring that ye are, the bandar log, or such thievish scum among ye, drive ye with idle words and chatterings even to the brink of death. So far have ye come, but no farther. The judge had snatched a villager's gun and fired. Kappa Sahib fell, unspoken words upon his lips. His fair head draggled in the dust, and a red stain showed suddenly upon the white linen over his breast. A triumphant roar swept the mob from end to end. British rifles cracked out the answer, and the bullets went home, surely into the rioting mass. Amid shrill screams of pain and fury, the leaders rallied their men and charged forward. A second volley stopped them before young Kappa's prostrate body could be reached. Few had joined the attack, but now they were fewer, and neither of the leaders stood among them. That was the end. Bearing their dead and wounded, the rebels returned, wailing as they went. Before daylight, the townsmen were in their houses, and the villagers had passed through the jungle and regained their homes. Arms were concealed with all haste. The dead were buried, the wounded, for the most part, were hidden. Prisoners had been taken, but only an inconsiderable number. Before daylight also, the headman of the village and a native surgeon came stealthily from the judge's bungalow and went their ways. They had their order, and they went to spread it abroad. The order was silence. The headman had bowed himself to the earth when it was given, for he understood all that it meant. Prisoners would be brought before a brother, not only today, but tomorrow, and for many morrows. So much had the night given them. At noon, His Honour came stiffly into the courtroom, leaning upon the arm of his native servant. The collector, who was awaiting him there, feared that he had been injured by the rioters on the previous night, but he was quickly reassured. The judge, it seemed, had sprained his knee shortly after leaving the Malcolms' hospitable roof. It was nothing, a mere trifle, though indisputably painful. The collector seated himself near the bench and talked in a low voice. The ladies were all safe. No Europeans had been killed, and few injured. Kappa had been shot by some cowardly dog while parleying with the rioters, but there were good hopes of him. The judge was most truly concerned to hear of the calamity which had befallen Mr. Morn. Kappa immensely thankful to know that things were no worse with him. His Honour had heard little or nothing of what had happened during the riot, being laid by the leg, as it were, in his own room. The first batch of prisoners was brought in. At first the judge did not look at them. Afterward his eyes sought their gaze, and held it, and they knew him for their brother. They heard his soft voice speaking of them compassionately as wayward children whom mercy would win over, though harshness might confirm them in their foolish resistance to authority. The collector seemed to protest, but with gentle courtesy his objections were put aside. He leaned back in his chair, flushed and angry, as one after another the sullen-looking rebels were fined, and having paid what was demanded, were set at liberty. When the judge looked up again, a single prisoner stood before him, a wounded, hawk-faced native whose eyes blazed hate and contempt. The collector drew his chair closer to the bench and began to speak in gruff undertones. "A ringleader, man of some education, I understand qualified as a barrister and has taken to journalism. Must make an example of him, eh?" The judge, straining in agony of mind and body, was aware of sudden relief from the pain of his wound. The bandage had slipped, and blood was cooling the torturing fire. A deathly faintness was upon him, and through it he spoke distinctly again of mercy. They were all blind. The leaders were blind, the blind leading the blind. Blind, blind. The collector sprang up with a startled exclamation. A thin stream of blood trickled from behind his Honour's desk and went a twisting way down to the well of the court. He caught the judge in his arms as he fell forward and lowered him gently to the ground. Then it was seen that the unconscious man's clothes were saturated with blood. Instantly the court was cleared. A military surgeon cut away the blood-stained clothing from the judge's thigh and laid bare the clean wound made by a British bullet. A look passed between him and the collector, but never a word. Syed Mehta's life had ebbed with his blood, and so he passed, unawakened, from swoon to death. The English, as their way is, betrayed nothing. It was His Honour, the district judge of Golampur, who had died, and they gave him burial the next day with due regard to the high position which he had held in the service of H.M. the King and Emperor. A fog. Horn conclusion. The Story of a Gramophone by Fox Russell. The Saucy Sally was a vessel of renown. No blustering liner, no fussy tug, no squattering steamer. She, but a bluff-bowed, smartly painted, trim-built sailing barge, plying chiefly from the lower reaches of the Thames to ports west of Dover. She had no equal of her class at any point of sailing, and certainly her master, Mr. Joseph Pigg, was not the man to let her fair fame suffer for want of seamanship. Captain Pigg, as he insisted upon being called, was a great, hairy-faced man with brawny muscles and a bloodshot eye. And in these respects his mate, Bob Topper, greatly favoured him. In fact, their physical resemblance was rather marked, but their tastes were in no way similar. The captain was fond of his glass. Whilst the mate was a blue-ribbon man, Joseph Pigg couldn't bear music in any form. Whilst the total abstainer had a weakness for the flute, and would not infrequently burst into song, the skipper hated women, whereas the mate was, what he himself called, a bit of a gay Lathero. But notwithstanding these dissimilarities of tastes and disposition, they got along fairly well together, and both met on the common ground of getting as much work out of the two hands as was ordinarily possible. The skipper didn't drink alcoholic liquors before the mate, and the mate returned the compliment by refraining from any musical outrage in the hearing of his superior officer. One hot summer afternoon, when the Saucy Sally was taking in cargo and the skipper was ashore, Mr. Topper, seated on the coamings of the hatchway, abandoned himself to the melancholy pleasures of Haydn's surprise. the tune being rung out of a tarnished German silver flute. Kitty Wakejack, one of the crew, was seated as far as possible, for Art, vainly trying to absorb his tea and stop his ears at one and the same time, whilst his fellow sufferer, Bill Brown, having hastily dived below, lay in his bunk, striving to deaden the weird wailing sounds that filled the ship. And just as Haydn's surprise was halfway through, for the 7th time, the skipper walked on board. The flutist stopped short and stared up at him. "Didn't expect you back so soon, Captain," he said in confused tones. "No. What's that owlin' row you're making?" "I dunno about no owlin' row, but, well, I do. I s'pose, accordin' to you, I ain't got no musical ear," sneered Captain Pig. This here tune." "Yes. This disgusting noise. What is it?" The mate looked sulky. "This is Haydn's Surprise," he growled. "So I should think. I dunno who the bloke was, but it must have given Haydn quite a turn. Don't let's 'ave no more of it." "Well, I don't see as there's no harm in music, and I didn't loose it off when you was about. I know you don't like it, so I studied your peculiarities. Fact is, I studies you too much." And the mate looked mutinous. Captain Pig scowled. "You shet your head," he grunted as he stamped off below. He went to a small cupboard in the corner of the cabin, and mixed himself a stiff go of gin and water, which he tossed off at one gulp, saying, "Haydn's sprees, eh? Haydn's sprees be didished. Don't come no spreezes here, while I'm master of the Saucy Sally." After this slight breeze, things quickly settled down again on the old lines between master and mate, and the voyage to Chichester Harbour was entirely uneventful, the barge bringing up at a snug anchorage near Emsworth. The next day Mr. Topper had undressed and gone overboard for a swim. After this, climbing up the bobstay, he regained the deck and proceeded to dry his hairy frame on an ancient flannel shirt. In the midst of this occupation, temporarily forgetful of his superior officer's prejudices, he broke into song. 30 seconds after he had let go the first howl, the skipper's head was thrust up the companionway. "What'd you want to make all that row about? Anything disagreed with you? If so, why don't you take something for it? It's a funny thing you can't let a man alone, when all he's a-doing is making a bit of harmony on board," replied the mate, pausing in the act of drying his shock head. "Harmony be driven overboard," cried Mr. Stoughton Pig wrathfully. "Now, look here, Bob Topper. I ain't a unreasonable man in my likes and dislikes, but it ain't fair to sing at a fellow creature with the voice nature fitted you out with. I never done, you know, harm." Next day, the Saucy Sally shipped some shingle ballast, got under way on the first of the ebb tide, and safely threading her way past the shallows and through the narrow channels of the harbour, emerged into the open sea and turned her bluff-bowed stem eastwards. The following afternoon, as Bob Topper took his trick at the wheel, he ruminated on the mutability of human affairs in general, and the contrariness of skippers in particular. "Won't have no music, won't he? Well, I reckon it's like religion when the missionaries is a-shoving of it into the African niggers. They just jolly well got to aim it. And so it'll be with the old man. I'll just fix up a scheme as'll do him a treat." He smiled broadly, and when Bob Topper smiled, the corners of his mouth seemed to almost meet at the back of his head. And as soon as the Saucy Sally had pitched and tossed her way up channel, for she was light as a cork in ballast, and dropped anchor a little way off Gravesend, Bob Topper sculled himself ashore. 20 minutes after stepping out of the boat, he was seated in the back parlour of a friend, a musical instrument maker. When Mr. Topper went aboard again, he carried under his arm a large brown paper package, which he smuggled below, without encountering the skipper, who was in his cabin at the time, communing with a bill of lading and a glass of Hollands neat. And, soon after the mate had come aboard, the captain went ashore. And then Mr. Topper laid himself out for some tranquil enjoyment on quite an unusual scale. He unfastened the package, produced a gramophone, brought it onto the deck, and started. The Washington Post. "Kitty-waker, Jack!" And Bill Brown immediately fled below. The mate sat on the edge of the hatch and gazed lovingly at the new instrument of torture. As he beat time to the inspiring strains with a belaying pin. When the Washington Post was finished, he laid on Jacksonville with a chorus of human laughter which sounded quite eerie. And so intent was he on this occupation that he never even noticed the approach of Captain Pig's boat until it was almost alongside. The skipper clambered aboard, looking black as thunder. This new outrage was not to be borne. Just as his foot touched the deck, the instrument gave forth its unholy cachinnation of "ha, ha, ha," in the high nasal tones peculiar to its kind. Captain Pig was not easily disconcerted, but this ghostly "ha, ha, ha" was a distinct trial to his nerves. He thrust his hands deep into his coat pockets, glared at the mate, and then growled, "What'ja got there? More harmony?" "Gramophone," was the mate's brief reply. He was getting sulky. "Grammar be blowed! Worst grammar I ever aired," returned Pig. "Turn the blooming thing off, and turn it off at the main. Enough to give any respectable Law Aberdeen sailorman. The ump." He proceeded 2 steps down the companion, then hurled this parting shot at the offending mate. "You ought to be head of a laundry, where the handle of the mangle turns a piano organ as well. Work and play," he concluded scornfully as he disappeared from the musician's sight below. The mate whistled softly. Then he stopped the offending instrument and conveyed it below. "P'raps the old man'll be glad of it one of these days," he muttered mysteriously. The next trip of the Saucy Sally was a more eventful one. She left Tilbury in a light haze, which first thickened into a pale-coloured fog, and then, aided by the smoke from the tall chimneys, to a regular pea-souper. The mate, taking advantage of the captain's spell below, brought up a long yard of tin, which looked remarkably like the Saucy Sally's foghorn, and quietly slipped it overboard. As they got lower and lower down the river, the fog increased, and both Captain Pig and Topper experienced a certain amount of anxiety as, first, another barge, then a tramp steamer, and finally a huge liner, all sounding their foghorns loudly, passed them considerably too close for comfort. The skipper himself was at the wheel, and, coughing the raw, damp fog out of his throat, he shouted hoarsely to Topper, "Better get our foghorn going, mate." "Aye, aye, skipper. It's in your cabin, ain't it?" "Yes, in the first locker." The mate descended the companion steps with a mysterious smile on his face, and his dexter optic closed. The casual observer might have thought that Mr. Topper was actually indulging in a wink. After a time he reappeared on deck, walked aft, and said, "Foghorn don't seem nowheres about, skipper. Thought you always kept her in your charge." Captain Pig whisked the wheel round just in time to escape a tug, fussing upstream, and feeling her way through the fog at half speed, and then he grunted sourly, "So I do. What the delay in finding it is, I can't understand." Catch hold of the spokes, and I'll go. Always got to do everything myself on this old tank, seems to me." And thus grumbling, Captain Pig went below, not altogether unwillingly, as, being a man who understood the importance of economizing time, he combined his search for the foghorn with the quenching of a highly useful thirst. But when he came on deck again, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he was unaccompanied by the foghorn. "Where the blamed thing's got to, I dunno." More in the dead. "I see it there, myself, not 2 days ago, but it ain't nowheres to be found now." "Rather awkward, skipper, ain't it, in all this maze of shipping?" returned Mr. Topper with a half-turn at the wheel. "Yes, I don't more'n half like it," returned the captain uneasily. My nerves aren't quite what they was, and a fog's a thing as I never could abide." On glided the Saucy Sally, almost the only one on the great waterway which spoke not, in the midst of a babel of confusing sounds. Sirens whooped, steam whistles shrieked hoarsely, the raucous voices of foghorns proclaimed the whereabouts of scores of craft, passing up and down the river, but the trim-built barge slid noiselessly along ghost-like in the dun-coloured smother, giving no intimation of her proximity. Then it was that Mr. Fee, Bob Topper's moment for action, arrived. In casual tones he observed to the skipper, "Pity, we ain't got something as'll make a sound of some kind, so's to let people know as we be a-comin'." Captain Pig said nothing, but the anxiety deepened perceptibly in his face. "Where the blank are ye comin' to?" roared the voice of another bargeman, as, tooting loudly on a foghorn, one of the Medway flyers shaved past them. "Near thing, that," observed the mate calmly. Captain Pig went a shade paler beneath the tan on his weather-beaten face. "Cuss him! Careless hound!" he muttered. "Might have sunk us." "Had no proper lookout, I expect," returned Mr. Stir. "Topper, even if he couldn't see anything, and we got no foghorn to show him where we was, ye see." "No. And p'raps we shall go to the bottom. All along, our having lost our old bit of tin." "It's a awful thing to think of, ain't it?" said Captain Pig solemnly. The mate appeared to be in a brown study. Then, as though he had subtly been inspired, he exclaimed, "What about the gramophone, skipper?" Even in the midst of his perturbation, Captain Pig looked askance at mention of the hated instrument. But it was a case of any port in a storm, and, with a grim nod, he relieved the mate at the wheel and said, "Fetch the bloomin' consarn up." Mr. Topper obeyed, with alacrity in his step and a wink in his eye. The consarn was quickly brought on deck, and the Washington Post let loose on the astonished ears of fog-smothered mariners right and left of them. One old shellback, coming up river on a Gravesend shrimper, listened in blank astonishment for a minute, and then confided huskily to his mate that he thought their time had come. "Evenly strains. It's what they calls the music of the spears," he said mysteriously. "Hengel's music what comes just before a bloke's time's up. We better prepare for the worst." His mate, less superstitious and with more common sense, rejoined, "Garn! Music of the spears be blowed. It's more like a piano organ or a hurdy-gurdy." The shrimper glided on, and a tramp steamer, going dead slow, just shaved past the musical barge. Its master roared derisively from the bridge, "Hullo, barge ahoy! What you got there? Punch and Judy show aboard," which cost Captain Pig a nasty twinge. He had always prided himself on his seaman-like ways, and to proceed thus down the great river like a mountebank, or a cockney out on a bank holiday, hurt his feelings more than he could say. Yet another insult was to be hurled at the Saucy Sally, for Jacksonville, with its weird human chorus, having been turned on when the "ha, ha, ha" rang out on the ears of a passing tug's captain, that outraged gentleman, thinking he was being personally derided, shouted, as the tide swept them out of sight, "Yeah! Oh, you laughing at? Set of bloomin' monkeys!" But the gramophone was certainly playing a useful part in warning others off the Saucy Sally down that fog-laden river. And when, at the end of their day's slow journey, they let go their anchor, the Washington Post was again nasally shrieking out its March-time glories. The mate stopped the machine and carried it tenderly below. Then, returning to the deck, he observed, "Good job as we had the gramophone aboard, Captain." Captain Pig swallowed a lump in his throat and looked like a child confronted with a dose of nauseous medicine, as he gruffly replied, "It's better nothin' when you wants a row made." A pause ensued, and then the skipper went on, "In future, I don't object. Not very much to the damophone gramophone. I mean, if you can stand music, well, so can I. But you can't contrast the beauty o' the two instruments, and I'm going ashore, straight away, to buy myself a good, old-fashioned foghorn. The tone of that is altogether more harmonious and more soothing to the ear than that there beastly gramophone ever could be." The mate heaved a deep sigh and sorrowfully went below. In the effort to ram music into his superior officer, he had to admit himself defeated. V.I. Mary Jane's Devotion, A Western Tale, by Charles Alden, Seltzer. Texas. Rankin stood in the street in front of the High Card Saloon, his lank body trembling with surprise, indecision, and indignation, his face alight with the fire of outraged dignity. 3 long paces from him stood Sheriff Webster, indifferently fondling an ivory-handled .45. The sheriff was nonchalantly deliberative in his actions, betraying only a negative interest in Rankin's movements, for Rankin's holster yawned with eloquent emptiness. With his empty holster dragging on his desires, it seemed to Rankin that to await the sheriff's pleasure was his most logical course. And so he waited. The sheriff had come upon him when, in an incautious moment, he had emerged from the High Card Saloon, having forgotten the very important fact that the sheriff was looking for him. This forgetfulness had been the cause of his undoing, for at the instant he had turned to go down the street, the sheriff had reached for his gun. The empty holster was evidence of his success. After that, there was no use in getting excited. True, Texas had flashed around in his tracks when he had felt the gun leaving its holster, and had made a lightning movement with his hand to prevent such a disgraceful occurrence. But he might just as well have reached for a rainbow. As he had faced about, rage flushed and impotent, he saw his gun swinging loosely in Webster's left hand, while in Webster's right hand another big 6-shooter had reached a foreboding level. The distance between the two men approximated 10 feet, for Webster had wisely stepped back, knowing Rankin's reluctance toward submission. And now, over the 10 feet of space, captive and captor surveyed one another with that narrowing of the eyes which denotes tension and warns of danger. "I reckon I was too quick for you, Texas," said Webster, with a gentleness that fell too softly to be genuine. Rankin gazed dolefully at his empty holster. The skin tensed over his teeth in a grinning sneer. "I ain't saying that you took a mean advantage," he said, raising his eyes and allowing them an expression of mild innocence that contrasted strangely with his drawn lips. "But you might have given me a chance to fight it out square. I wouldn't have took your gun, Jim." Knowing Texas less intimately, the sheriff might have been misled by this crude sentiment, but the sheriff's fingers only drew more closely around the ivory handle of his .45, and there came a glint of humor into his eyes. "I ain't saying you would, Texas, but as sheriff of Socorro County, I ain't taking any chances. I wanted to talk to you, and I knew if I had your gun, I'd feel easier." "Which means that you didn't want me to have a chance," complained Texas glumly. "Socorro's always been meaner'n. 'Tain't Socorro's fault," interrupted the sheriff with a sudden coldness. "You've been cutting didos in Socorro for so long a time that you've disgraced yourself. You've gambled and shot yourself into disfavor with the elite. You've been as ornery and as compromising as it's possible for any human maverick to get without having to requisition the unwilling mourners. Not that I'm saying you're naturally bad, Texas. It's that you've got an overdose of what them modern brain specialists call exaggerated ego, which us common critters would call plain swell head. That their disease is listed and catalogued in the textbooks of the New York Medical Institute as bearing a close relationship to the genie loco, which is a scientific way of saying that you've got buzzers in your attic." Texas smiled, showing his teeth in wan sarcasm. "You wouldn't say that if I had my gun, Jim. It ain't like you to pour out your blackguardisms on a man what ain't armed." "I ain't blackguarding you none," said Webster easily. "It's the naked truth, and you know it. Taking your gun was part of my official duty. Personally, I could have talked to you without trampling down any of the niceties of etiquette, but officially I had to have your gun." Rankin's face lengthened with a deep melancholy. With this expression he intended to convey the impression that he was suffering a martyrdom, but the sheriff's acquaintance with Texas was not recent. "And now that you've got the gun," said Texas after an embarrassed silence, "what's the next thing on the program?" "Taking your gun," said the sheriff heavily, "was a preliminary, like they say in the sporting papers. The big event is that you're going to say your adieus to Socorro without being allowed to make any farewell announcement. The reason is that you and Es Socorro is incongruous like a side saddle on a razorback hog. Socorro won't stand for you a minute longer. You're a public favorite, which has lost its popularity, and which has become heterogeneous to the established order of things. In other words, you're an outlaw, a soft-spoken, lazy, good-for-nothing road agent. And though Socorro ain't never had anything on you before, it knows you had a hand in robbing the express office last night. And you're a dam, like playing a kingful against 3 deuces that you done the trick. You were seen going toward the station about an hour before Bud Tucker found Ridgely, the agent, stretched out on the floor of the office. A bullet from a .45 clean through him. And there's $5,000 in gold gone and no trace of it. And there's been no strangers in town. And here's your gun, showing plain that it's been shot off lately, for there's the powder smudge on the cylinder and the barrel. That's a pay streak of circumstantial evidence, or I ain't Sheriff of Socorro." Rankin's eyes had flashed with an unusual brilliancy as the sheriff had spoken of him being seen going toward the station previous to the finding of the agent's body, but they glazed over with unconcern during the rest of the recital. And, as the sheriff concluded, Rankin gazed scornfully at him, sneering mildly. "I couldn't add nothing to what you've just said." He idly kicked the grey dust that was mounded at his feet, standing loose and inert, as though he cared little what might be the outcome of this impromptu interview. And then, suddenly, his blue eyes twinkled humorously as he raised them to meet the sheriff's. "Give you time, you might tell me where I spent the money," he said dryly. "There's no telling where your theorizing might end." The sheriff ignored this, but he eyed his prisoner meditatively. "There's been a rumor," he said coldly, "that you've got cracked on my daughter Mary Jane, but I ain't never been able to properly confirm it. I meant to tell you some time ago that while I ain't had no objection to living in the same town with you, I'm some opposed to having you for a son-in-law. But now, since the express robbery, it won't be necessary for me to tell you not to nose around my house, for you're going to ride straight out of Socorro County, and you ain't coming back any more. If you do, I reckon you'll discover that Socorro's present leniency ain't elastic enough to be stretched to cover your homecoming." "I ain't saying nothing," said Texas, glancing with pensive eyes to a point far up the sun-baked street where his gaze rested upon a pretentious house in a neatly fenced yard where there were green things that gave a restful impression. "Circumstantial evidence is sure convincing." He sighed deeply. "I reckon you knowed all along that I thought a heap of Mary Jane. That's the reason you picked me out for the express job." He scowled as his eyes took in the meager details of Socorro's one street. Because of long association, these details had become mental fixtures. Socorro had been his home for 10 years, and in 10 years things grow into a man's heart. And civic pride had been his one great virtue. If, in the summer, the alkali dust of the street formed into miniature hills of greyish-white, which sifted into surrounding hollows under the whipping tread of the cow-pony's hoofs, Texas likened it unto ruffled waters that seek a level. The same condition in another town would have drawn a curse from him. If, in the winter, the huge windrows of caked mud stretched across the street in unlovely phalanx, Texas was reminded of itinerant mountain ranges. The stranger who would be so unwary as to take issue with him on this point would regret if he lived. The unpainted shanties, the huddled, tottering dives, the tumble-down express station, all, even the maudlin masquerade of the high-card saloon, were institutions inseparable from his thoughts, inviolable and sacred in the measure of his love for them. And now... Something caught in his throat and gave forth a choking sound. "But I reckon it's just as well," he said resignedly. "I sure ain't of much account." He hesitated and smiled weakly at the sheriff. "I ain't croaking," he said apologetically. "There's the circumstantial evidence." He hesitated again, evidently battling a ponderous question. "You didn't happen to hear Mary Jane say anything about the express job?" he questioned, with an expression of dog-like hopefulness. "Anything that would lead you to believe she knowed about it?" "I don't see what." "No, of course." He shuffled his feet awkwardly. "And so she don't know anything? Didn't mention me at all?" The hopefulness was gone from his eyes, and in its place was the dull glaze of puzzled wonder. "Not that it makes any difference," he added quickly, as he caught a sudden sharp glance from the sheriff's eyes. "Anne! So, I'm to leave Socorro." He looked dully at the sheriff. "Why, of course, there's the circumstantial evidence." His eyes swept the shanties, the street, the timber-dotted sides of the mountains that rose above the town, familiar landmarks of his long sojourn, landmarks that brought pleasant memories. "I've lived here a long time," he said with abrupt melancholy, his voice grating with suppressed regret. "I won't forget soon." There ensued a silence which lasted long. It brought a suspicious lump into the sheriff's throat. "I wouldn't take it so hard, Texas," he said gently. "Maybe it'll be the best for you in the long run. If you get away from here, maybe you make a man. Quit your damn croaking, flashback Texas. I ain't asking for none of your mushy sentiment." He straightened up suddenly and smiled with set lips. "I guess I've been a fool. If you'll hand over that six-shooter, I'll be going. I've got business in San Marshal." "I'll walk up to the station platform and lay the gun there," said the sheriff coldly, for Texas was less dangerous at a distance. "And when you see me start away from the platform, you can start for the gun. I'm taking your word that you'll leave peaceable." And so, with his gun again in its holster, Texas threw himself astride his pinto pony and loped down toward the sloping banks of the Rio Grande del Norte. A quarter of a mile from town, he halted on the bare knob of a low hill and took a lingering look at the pretentious house amid the green surroundings. Near the house was something he had not seen when he had looked before, the flutter of a white dress against the background of green. As he looked, the white figure moved rapidly through the garden and disappeared behind the house. "She didn't say a word," said Texas chokingly. 10 hours out of Socorro, Texas, Rankin rode morosely into San Marshal. Into San Marshal, the unbeautiful, with its vista of unpainted shanties and lurid dives. For in San Marshal foregathered the men of the mines and the ranges, men of forgotten morals, but of brawn and muscle, whose hearts beat not with a yearning for high ideals, but with a lust for wealth and gain, white, Indian, Mexican, half-breed, predatory spirits of many nations, opposed in the struggle for existence. For 10 hours Texas had ridden the river trail, and for 10 hours his ears had been burdened with the dull beat of his pony's hoofs on the matted mesquite grass, and the rattle of his wooden stirrups against the chaparral growth. and for 10 hours his mind had been confused with a multitude of perplexities and resentments. But all mental confusions reach a culminating point when the mind finally throws aside the useless chaff of thought and considers only the questions that have to do with the heart. Wherefore, Texas Rankin's mind dwelt on Mary Jane. Subconsciously, his mind harbored rebellion against her father, who had judged him, against Socorro, which had misunderstood him, against fate, which had been unjust. All these atoms of personal interest were elements of a primitive emotion that finally evolved into one great concrete determination, that he would show Jim Webster, Socorro, Mary Jane the world, that he was not the creature they had thought him. Tearing aside all mental superfluities, there was revealed a new structure of thought. I am going to be a man again. And so, Texas rode his tired pony in the gathering dusk, down the wide street that was beginning to flicker with the shafts of light from grimy windows, down to the hitching rail in front of the top-notch saloon, where he dismounted and stood stiffly beside his beast while he planned his regeneration. Half an hour later, Texas sat opposite a man at a card table in the rear of the top-notch saloon. The man conversed easily, but it was noticeable that he watched Texas with cat-like vigilance, and that he poured his whiskey with his left hand. Ordinarily, Texas would have noticed this departure from the polite rules, but laboring under the excitement that his new determination brought him, he was careless. For he had planned his regeneration, and his talk with the man was the beginning. "You lifted the express box at Socorro, Buck," said Texas, so earnestly that the table trembled. Buck Rebo, gambler, outlaw, murderer, pushed back his broad-brimmed hat with his hand always. He used his left and gazed with level, menacing eyes at Texas. His lips parted with a half-sneer. "If a man does a job nowadays, there's always someone wants in on it," he declared, voicing his suspicion of Rankin's motive in bringing up the subject. "Because you was lucky in being close when the game come off is the reason you want a share of the cash," he added satirically. "How much?" "Go easy, Buck," said Texas. "I ain't no angel, but I never played your style. I ain't asking for a share." "Then what in?" "It's a new deal," declared Texas heavily. "A square deal. You took $5,000 out of Socorro, and you salivated the agent doing it. Jim Webster thought it was me, and I was invited to a farewell performance in which I'd done the starring. Some night prowler saw me down near the station just before you made your grand entree, and serves you right for spooning with a female so close to where gentleman has business," said Buck. "I saw her when you come toward me shooting." "And what makes it more aggravating," continued Texas, unmoved by the interruption, "is that the lady was Jim Webster's daughter, and we was thinking of getting married. But we didn't want Jim to know just then. And she told me to keep mum, seeing that Jim was opposed. She said we'd keep it secret until—" "I admire the lady's choice," said Buck, sneering ironically. "Until I braced up and was a man again," went on Texas, with bulldog persistency. "Then you wasn't thinking of getting married soon?" slurred Buck. "I reckon we was," returned Texas coldly. "That's why I came here. I'm going to take that 5,000 back to Socorro with me." And now Buck used his right hand. But quick as he was late. Rankin's gun gaped at him across the table, the while his own weapon lagged tardily halfway in its holster. "I'm going to be a man again," said Texas. There was a positiveness in his voice that awoke thoughts of death and violence. "You damn—" began Buck. "I'll count 10, said Texas frigidly. "If the money ain't on the table, then I reckon you won't care what becomes of it. 1, 2... With a snarl of rage and hate, Buck rose from his chair and sprang clear, his gun flashing to a level with the movement, its savage roar shattering the silence. Texas did not wince as the heavy bullet struck him, but his face went white. He had been a principal in more than one shooting affray, and experience had taught him the value of instantaneous action. And so, even with the stinging pain in his left shoulder, his hand swept his gun lightly upward, and before it had reached a level, he had begun to pull the trigger. But to his astonishment, only the metallic click of the hammer striking the steel of the cylinder rewarded his efforts. Once, twice, thrice, so rapidly that the metallic clicks blended. And now he saw why he was to meet his death at the muzzle of Buck's gun. Fearing him, Jim Webster had removed the cartridges from his weapon before returning it to him that morning. He had committed a fatal error in not examining it after he had received it from Webster's hand. The law, in judging him, had removed his chance of life, but he smiled with bitter irony into Buck's eyes as the latter, still snarling and relentless, deliberately shot again, once, twice, according to the ancient custom which has many champions, and to the conventions which are not to be violated with impunity. Texas should have recovered from his wounds to return to Mary, Jane, and Socorro. No narrative is complete without the entire vindication of the brave and the triumph of the honorable, but to the chronicler belongs only the simple task of true and conscientious record. Therefore is the end written thus. Came to Jim Webster's home in Socorro, a week later, a babbler from San Marshal, who told a tale. There was a man by the name of Texas. Rankin came down to San Marshal last week and went gunning for Buck Ribble. Quickest thing you ever saw. Buck peppered him so fast you couldn't count, and I'm told Texas wasn't no slouch with a gun either. Dead? Questioned Webster. As a door-nail, returned the babbler. Socorro's bad man, said Webster sententiously. Wasn't a bit of good in him. Gambling, shooting, outlaw. Best job Buck ever done. He found Mary Jane in the kitchen, singing over the supper dishes. Texas Rankin is dead over at San Marshal, he said, with the importance of one communicating delectable news. Mary Jane continued with her dishes, looking at her father over her shoulder with a mild unconcern.
At San Marshal?
She said wonderingly.
I didn't know he had left Socorro.
A week now, returned Webster with much complacence. Fired him from Socorro for doing that express job. Socorro's bad enough without Texas. His mouth opened with dumb astonishment as Mary Jane whirled around on him with a laugh on her lips. Why, Dad, Texas Rankin didn't do that job. It was Buck Ribble. Texas told me the night it happened. We were walking down near the station and we heard some shooting. I wasn't close enough to see plainly, but Texas said he could recognize Buck by the flash of his gun. And so Texas is dead. I thought, said Webster feebly, that you was pretty sweet on Texas. Sweet, said Mary Jane, blushing with maidenly modesty. Socorro is so dull. A young lady must have some diversion. Then you don't care. Why, Dad, you old sober-sides, to think why I was only fooling with him. It was fun to see how serious. In that case, began Webster, and then he went out and sat on the front stoop. Far into the night he sat, and always he stared in the direction of San Marshal, vi. Between Friends, a story of the Italian Quarter, by Adriana Spadoni. Vincenza looked from the 3 crisp dollar bills to her husband and back again, wonderingly and with fear in her eyes. I understand nothing, Gino, and I am afraid. Perhaps it will bring the sickness. The money it is of the devil. Maybe... Luigi laughed, but a little uneasily. It is time, then, that the devil went to paradise. He makes better for us than the saints, to whom you pray so. Shh. Vincenza crossed herself quickly. That is a great wickedness. Luigi picked up the bills, examining them closely. Apparently they were good. Nevertheless, he put them down again, and went on carving a wooden cow for the little Carolina, with a puzzled look in his black eyes. Do you know? Vincenza stopped undressing the baby suddenly when the thought came to her. Go thou and ask Biagio. He has been many years in this country, and, besides, he is also a Genovese. He will tell thee. Luigi's eyes cleared, but he condescended to make no reply. It is not for a man to take the advice of a woman. But when it was dark, and Vincenza had gone to lie down with the little one, Luigi took his hat and went over to the shop of Biagio Francini. Biagio listened attentively. His pudgy hands, crossed on his stomach, rose and fell with the undulations of the rows of flesh beneath. From time to time he ceased for a moment the contemplation of the strings of garlic and sausage that hung from the fly-specked ceiling of his diminutive shop, and turned his little black eyes sharply on Luigi. So, he said at last, today a lady came to thy house, and after to ask many questions left these $3. It was in this way? Just so, replied Luigi, and questions the most marvelous I have ever heard. And in this country, where everyone asks the questions, how long that I do not work, and if we have to eat? Luigi laughed. Of a surety, Biagio, she asked that. She sees that we live, and she asks if we eat ma, chi, and then if we have every day the meat. When I said once, sometimes twice in the week thou knowest, it is not possible to have more often. When one waits to buy the house, then it was she, put on the table the $3, and gave me a paper to sign. Thou didst sign nothing? Biagio spoke eagerly. No, once I signed the paper in English, and it cost me $2, not again. I said I could not write, and she wrote for me. Bene. Biagio nodded approval. It is not thy writing. It can do nothing. Perhaps it is because I voted twice at the election last week, but already I have taken the money for that. It was one only dollar. Non, it is not that. Listen. Slowly Biagio shut both eyes, as if to keep out the tremendous light that had dawned upon him, and nodded his head knowingly. Then he opened them, shifted his huge bulk upright, and clapped Luigi on the knee. Thou art in great luck, friend, he cried, and it is well that thou hast asked me. If thou hadst gone to another, to a man not honest, who knows? Listen. In our country, when a rich man dies, he leaves always something for the poor, but he leaves it to the church, and it is the fathers who give away the money. Corpo di Bacco. What that means, thou knowest well. Sometimes a little gets to the poor. Sometimes, but in this country it is not so. He leaves to a society. There are many, and they pay the women, and sometimes the men, to give away the money. Santo Cristo, gasped Luigi. They pay to give away the money? For them it is a job like any other. Didst think it was for love of thee, or the red curls of thy Vincenza? Marvellous, most marvellous, murmured Luigi, and it is possible then for all people to get that no one can explain. And Biagio shrugged his shoulders in a gesture of absolute inability to solve the problem. She will come then again, this lady. Luigi leaned forward eagerly. He was beginning to grasp it. It is for thee to say, Stop, my son, if thou hast in thy head anything but fat. But thou art a Genovese. Only I say. Biagio laid a grimy thumb across his lips and winked knowingly. Tell to none. Thanks, many thanks, friend. Luigi's voice was deeply grateful. "Perhaps some day I can do for thee?" "It is nothing, nothing," insisted Biagio, patting the air with his pudgy hands in a gesture of denial. "A little kindness between friends." At great inconvenience to himself, Biagio held the door open to give Luigi more light in crossing the street. As he closed it and turned out the gas, he smiled to himself. "And each bottle of oil will cost thee 10 cents more, friend. Business is business, and yesterday thy Vincenza returned the carrots because they were not fresh." Ecco. Back in his own room, Luigi folded the 3 notes neatly, while Vincenza watched him, her grey eyes wide with wonder. "Marvellous, marvellous," she whispered, just as Luigi had done. "Tonight I thank the Virgin." As Biagio had foretold, the lady in fur came every day. Luigi did not understand all that she said, but he always listened politely and smiled, with his dark eyes and his lips and his glistening white teeth. It made her feel very old to see Luigi smile like that. When he had to live in one room with a leaking water pipe and a garbage can outside the door. Sometimes she was almost ashamed to offer the $3, and she was grateful for the gentle, sweet way Luigi accepted it. Then one day, when the air was thick with snow, and the air in the tenement halls cut like needles of ice, and the lamps had to be lit at 2 o'clock, the lady in brown fur came unexpectedly. She had found work for Luigi. She kissed the little one, patted Vincenza's shoulder, and shook hands with Luigi. Again and again she made him repeat the name and address to make sure he had it quite right. The lady in brown fur was very happy. When she went, Vincenza leaned far over the banisters with the lamp, while Luigi called out in his soft, broken English directions for avoiding the lines of washing below and the refuse piled in dark turns of the stairs. When the lady in brown fur had disappeared, Vincenza turned to Luigi. "Of a surety, cara, the saints are good. Never before didst thou work before April. In the new house we will keep for ourselves 2 rooms. These people have the pull even more than the alderman, Biagio says," replied Luigi with a dreamy look in his eyes. "It may be that from this work I shall take $3 each day." "Madonna mia," gasped Vincenza, "it is beyond belief." For 5 days, Luigi stood 4 hours each afternoon, bent forward to the lifting of a cardboard block, while Hugh Keswick painted, as he had not painted for months, the tense muscles under the olive skin, the strong neck and shoulders. The building of the temple advanced rapidly, and Luigi's arms and back ached, so that each night Vincenza had to rub them with the oil which now cost 10 cents more in the shop of Biagio. On the 6th day, Luigi refused to go. "I tell thee it is a stupidness to stand all day with the pain in the back. For what?" 50 cents. "It is a work for old men and children. But thou canst not make the money sitting in thy chair with thy feet on the stove like now. Dost thou wish then that I have every night the knives in my back?" "If so." "Not so, Caro, but listen. You understand nothing and talk as a woman. A lady comes to my house. She says you have no work. Here is money. Then she comes and says here is work. But at this work I make not so much as before she gave, and in addition I have the pain in the back. Ecco, when she comes again, I no longer have the work. It is her job to give away the money. She is not a fool, that lady in brown fur. It is that I make her a kindness." "Not so?" "As thou sayest." And Vincenza went on with her endless washing. But when the week passed, and the lady in brown fur did not come, Luigi's forehead wrinkled with the effort to understand. When the 2nd had gone, Luigi was openly troubled. When the 3rd was half over, he again took his hat and went over to the shop of Biagio. As before, Biagio listened attentively, his eyes closed, until Luigi had finished. Then he opened them, made a clicking noise with his tongue, and laid one finger along the side of his nose. "Holy body of Christ," he said softly, "in business thou hast the head like a rock. In one curl of thy Vincenza there is more sense than in all thy great body. Did I not tell thee to be careful, and it would stop only when thou didst wish? And now, without to ask my advice, you make the stupidness ba, ma. Dio mio!" Luigi's hands made angry protest against the invective of Biagio. "I said only like a man of sense. It is her job, it make no difference. Blood of the lamb! Thou hast been in America 8 months, and thou dost not know that they are mad, all quite mad, to work? Never do they stop. Even after to have 50 years, think 50 years, still they work. They work even with the children old enough to keep them." For many months, the skinny one, she who gives milk to the baby of Giacomo, had the habit to find him such work, like the foolishness of your painter. And Giacomo has already 3 children, more than 15. Ma! Biagio snorted his contempt. Then, suddenly, his manner changed. He leaned back in his chair and apparently dismissed the subject with a wave of his fat hand. "And the little Carolina? She is well in this weather of the devil?" But Luigi did not answer. He was thinking with a pucker between his black eyes. Biagio watched him narrowly. At last he spoke, looking fixedly at the sausages above his head. "Of course it is possible you have made a mistake. But—" Luigi leaned forward eagerly. "It is possible, then, to—" "All things are possible." Biagio nodded his head at the sausages, blinking like a large, fat owl. Then he stopped. "Perhaps you will tell to me." Luigi was forced to it at last. Biagio gave a little grunt, as if he were being brought back from a deep meditation. "There is a way," he said slowly. "If thou write to her of the brown fur that thou art sick and cannot do the work, but never in my life was I better. Only last week, Giacomo said, I have grown fat. How the—" "It is possible," replied Biagio wearily, "to be sick of a sickness that makes one neither thin nor white. With a sickness of the legs like the rheumatism, for example, one eats, one sleeps, only one cannot walk or stand for many hours." In spite of his efforts to the contrary, the wonder and admiration grew deeper in Luigi's eyes. "Thou thinkest I am sure." Now that Luigi was reduced to the proper state of humility, Biagio gave up his attitude of distant oracle and leaned close. "Thou hast made a mistake, but it is not too late. If thou dost wish, I will write it for thee. If thou sayest," replied Luigi. And now it was his turn to gaze at the strings of garlic. "If you will do this favor." "With pleasure." Biagio's fat hands made little gestures of willingness to oblige. "Of a truth, it is not much, but when one wishes to buy the house, and already the family is begun, $2.50 each week." Luigi glanced at him sharply. "2, and Biagio drew the ink to him and dipped his pen. $2.50 for thee, and for me." "Bene, bene," Luigi interrupted quickly. "It is only just." "Between friends," explained Biagio as he began to write. "Between friends," echoed Luigi, and added to himself, "Closer than the skin of a snake art thou, friend." The lady in the brown fur came next day. She had been very angry and disappointed in Luigi, too angry and disappointed to go near him. Now she felt very sorry and uncomfortable when she saw his right leg stretched out before, so stiff that he could not bend it. He smiled and made the motion of getting up, but could not do it, and sank back again with a gesture of helplessness more eloquent than words. When the lady in brown fur had gone, Vincenza found an extra bill, brand new, tucked into the pocket of the little Carolina. Luigi waited until he was quite sure that Biagio would be alone. There was a look of real sorrow in his dark eyes as he slipped a shiny quarter across the counter. "She left only 2, he explained. "The reason I do not know. Perhaps next time it is nothing between friends." Biagio slipped the quarter into the cigar box under the counter and smiled a fat smile at Luigi. But he did not hold the door open when Luigi went, and his little eyes were hard like gimlet points. "So," he whispered softly, "so. One learns quickly, very quickly, in this new country. Only $2 this time. Bene, Gino mio. The price of sausage, as that of oil, goes up between friends." 8. The Hammer Pond, Burglary. The Story of an Artist by H.G. Wells. It is a moot point whether burglary is to be considered as a sport, a trade, or an art. For a trade, the technique is scarcely rigid enough, and its claims to be considered an art are vitiated by the mercenary element that qualifies triumphs. On the whole, it seems to be most justly ranked a sport for which no rules are at present formulated, and of which the prizes are distributed in an extremely informal manner. It was this informality of burglary that led to the regrettable extinction of 2 promising beginners at Hammer Pond Park. The stakes offered in this affair consisted chiefly of diamonds and other personal bric-a-brac belonging to the newly married Lady Aveling. Lady Aveling, as the reader will remember, was the only daughter of Mrs. Montague Pangs, the well-known hostess. Her marriage to Lord Aveling was extensively advertised in the papers, the quantity and quality of her wedding presents, and the fact that the honeymoon was to be spent at Hammer Pond. The announcement of these valuable prizes created a considerable sensation in the small circle in which Mr. Stallion, Teddy Watkins, was the undisputed leader, and it was decided that, accompanied by a duly qualified assistant, he should visit the village of Hammer Pond in his professional capacity. Being a man of naturally retiring and modest disposition, Mr. Watkins determined to make his visit incog, and, after due consideration of the conditions of his enterprise, he selected the role of a landscape artist and the unassuming surname of Smith. He preceded his assistant, who, it was decided, should join him only on the last afternoon of his stay at Hammer Pond. Now, the village of Hammer Pond is perhaps one of the prettiest little corners in Sussex. Many thatched houses still survive. The flint-built church, with its tall spire nestling under the down, is one of the finest and least restored in the county, and the beech woods and bracken jungles through which the road runs to the great house are singularly rich in what the vulgar artist and photographer call bits. So that Mr. Watkins, on his arrival with 2 virgin canvases, a brand-new easel, a paint-boy, portmanteau, an ingenious little ladder made in sections, after the pattern of that lamented master, Charles Peace, crowbar, and wire coils, found himself welcomed with effusion and some curiosity by 6 other brethren of the brush. It rendered the disguise he had chosen unexpectedly plausible, but it inflicted upon him a considerable amount of aesthetic conversation for which he was very imperfectly prepared. "Have you exhibited very much?" said young Pawson, in the bar parlour of the Coach and Horses, where Mr. Watkins was skilfully accumulating local information on the night of his arrival. "Very little," said Mr. Watkins. "Just a snack here and there. Academy, in course, and at the Crystal Palace." "Did they hang you well?" said Pawson. "Don't rot," said Mr. Watkins. "I don't like it. I mean, did they put you in a good place?" "What you mean?" said Mr. Watkins suspiciously. "One 'ud think you were trying to make out I'd been put away." Pawson was a gentlemanly young man, even for an artist, and he did not know what being put away meant, but he thought it best to explain that he intended nothing of the sort. As the question of hanging seemed a sore point with Mr. Watkins, he tried to divert the conversation a little. "Did you do figure work at all?" "No, never had a head for figures," said Mr. Watkins. "My Mrs. Smith, I mean, does all that." "She paints too," said Porson. "That's rather jolly." "Very," said Mr. Watkins, though he really did not think so, and, feeling the conversation was drifting a little beyond his grasp, added, "I came down here to paint Hammer Pond House by moonlight." "Really?" said Porson. "That's rather a novel idea." "Yes," said Mr. Stash. "Watkins, I thought it rather a good notion when it occurred to me. I expect to begin tomorrow night." "What? You don't mean to paint in the open by night?" "I do, though." "But how will you see your canvas?" "Have a bloomin' copse," began Mr. Watkins, rising too quickly to the question, and then realizing this, bawled to Miss Durgan for another glass of beer. "I'm going to have a thing called a dark lantern," he said to Porson. "But it's about new moon now," objected Porson. "There won't be any moon." "There'll be the house," said Watkins. "At any rate, I'm going, you see, to paint the house first and the moon afterward." "Oh," said Porson, too staggered to continue the conversation. Towards sunset next day, Mr. Watkins, virgin canvas, easel, and a very considerable case of other appliances in hand, strolled up the pleasant pathway through the beech woods to Hammer Pond Park, and pitched his apparatus in a strategic position commanding the house. Here he was observed by Mr. Raphael Sant, who was returning across the park from a study of the chalk pits. His curiosity having been fired by Porson's account of the new arrival, he turned aside with the idea of discussing nocturnal art. Mr. Watkins was mixing colour with an air of great industry. Sant, approaching more nearly, was surprised to see the colour in question was as harsh and brilliant an emerald green as it is possible to imagine. Having cultivated an extreme sensibility to colour from his earliest years, he drew the air in sharply between his teeth at the very first glimpse of this brew. Mr. Watkins turned round. He looked annoyed. "What on earth are you going to do with that beastly green?" said Sant. Mr. Watkins realized that his zeal to appear busy in the eyes of the butler had evidently betrayed him into some technical error. He looked at Sant and hesitated. "Pardon my rudeness," said Sant, "but really, that green is altogether too amazing. It came as a shock. What do you mean to do with it?" Mr. Watkins was collecting his resources. Nothing could save the situation but decision. "If you come here interrupting my work," he said, "I'm a-going to paint your face with it." Sant retired, for he was a humorist and a peaceful man. Going down the hill, he met Porson and Wainwright. "Either that man is a genius, or he is a dangerous lunatic," said he. "Just go up and look at his green." And he continued his way, his countenance brightened by a pleasant anticipation of a cheerful affray round an easel in the gloaming, and the shedding of much green paint. But to Porson and Wainwright, Mr. Watkins was less aggressive, and explained that the green was intended to be the first coating of his picture. It was, he admitted in response to a remark, an absolutely new method, invented by himself. Twilight deepened. First one, then another star appeared. The rooks, amid the tall trees to the left of the house, had long since lapsed into slumberous silence. The house itself lost all the details of its architecture and became a dark grey outline. And then the windows of the salon shone out brilliantly. The conservatory was lighted up, and here and there a bedroom window burnt yellow. Had anyone approached the easel in the park, it would have been found deserted. One brief uncivil word in brilliant green sullied the purity of its canvas. Mr. Watkins was busy in the shrubbery with his assistant, who had discreetly joined him from the carriage drive. Mr. Watkins was inclined to be self-congratulatory upon the ingenious device by which he had carried all his apparatus boldly, and, in the sight of all men, right up to the scene of operations. "That's the dressing-room," he said to his assistant, "and as soon as the maid takes the candle away and goes down to supper, we'll call in. My, how nice the house do look, to be sure, against the starlight, and with all its windows and lights. Swap me, Jim. I almost wish I was a painter chap. Have you fixed that there wire across the path from the laundry?" He cautiously approached the house until he stood below the dressing-room window and began to put together his folding ladder. He was too experienced a practitioner to feel any unusual excitement. Jim was reconnoitering the smoking room. Suddenly, close beside Mr. Watkins in the bushes, there was a violent crash and a stifled curse. Someone had tumbled over the wire which his assistant had just arranged. He heard feet running on the gravel pathway beyond. Mr. Watkins, like all true artists, was a singularly shy man, and he incontinently dropped his folding ladder and began running circumspectly through the shrubbery. He was indistinctly aware of two people hot upon his heels, and he fancied that he distinguished the outline of his assistant in front of him. In another moment he had vaulted the low stone wall, bounding the shrubbery, and was in the open park. Two thuds on the turf followed his own leap. It was a close chase in the darkness through the trees. Mr. Watkins was a loosely built man and in good training, and he gained hand over hand upon the hoarsely panting figure in front. Neither spoke, but, as Mr. Watkins pulled up alongside, a qualm of awful doubt came over him. The other man turned his head at the same moment and gave an exclamation of surprise. "It's not Jim," thought Mr. Watkins, and simultaneously the stranger flung himself, as it were, at Watkins's knees, and they were forthwith grappling on the ground together. "Lend a hand, Bill," cried the stranger, as the third man came up. And Bill did 2 hands, in fact, and some accentuated feet. The fourth man, presumably Jim, had apparently turned aside and made off in a different direction. At any rate, he did not join the trio. Watkins's memory of the incidents of the next 2 minutes is extremely vague. He has a dim recollection of having his thumb in the corner of the mouth of the first man, and feeling anxious about its safety, and for some seconds at least he held the head of the gentleman, answering to the name of Bill, to the ground by the hair. He was also kicked in a great number of different places, and apparently by a vast multitude of people. Then the gentleman who was not Bill got his knee below Mr. Snee below, Watkins's diaphragm, and tried to curl him up upon it. When his sensations became less entangled, he was sitting upon the turf, and 8 or 10 men. The night was dark, and he was rather too confused to count standing around him, apparently waiting for him to recover. He mournfully assumed that he was captured, and would probably have made some philosophical reflections on the fickleness of fortune, had not his internal sensations disinclined him to speech. He noticed very quickly that his wrists were not handcuffed, and then a flask of brandy was put in his hands. This touched him a little. It was such unexpected kindness. "He's a-comin' round," said a voice which he fancied he recognized as belonging to the Hammer Pond second footman. "We've got 'em, sir, both of 'em," said the Hammer Pond butler, the man who had handed him the flask. "Thanks to you." No one answered his remark, yet he failed to see how it applied to him. "He's fair dazed," said a strange voice. "The villains half murdered him." Mr. Teddy Watkins decided to remain fair, dazed, until he had a better grasp of the situation. He perceived that 2 of the black figures round him stood side by side with a dejected air, and there was something in the carriage of their shoulders that suggested to his experienced eye hands that were bound together. In a flash, he rose to his position. He emptied the little flask and staggered obsequious hands assisting him to his feet. There was a sympathetic murmur. "Shake hands, sir, shake hands," said one of the figures near him. "Permit me to introduce myself. I am very greatly indebted to you. It was the jewels of my wife, Lady Aveling, which attracted these scoundrels to the house." "Very glad to make your lordship's acquaintance," said Teddy Watkins. "I presume you saw the rascals making for the shrubbery and dropped down on them?" "That's exactly how it happened," said Mr. Watkins. "You should have waited till they got in at the window," said Lord Aveling. "They would get it hotter if they had actually committed the burglary. And it was lucky for you two of the policemen were out by the gates and followed up the three of you. I doubt if you could have secured the two of them, though it was confoundedly plucky of you all the same." "Yes, I ought to have thought of all that," said Mr. Stepzyzul. "Watkins, but one can't think of everything." "Certainly not," said Lord Aveling. "I am afraid they have mauled you a little," he added. The party was now moving toward the house. "You walk rather lame. May I offer you my arm?" And instead of entering Hammerpond House by the dressing-room window, Mr. Watkins entered it slightly intoxicated, and inclined now to cheerfulness again on the arm of a real live peer and by the front door. "This," thought Mr. Watkins, "is burgling in style." The scoundrels, seen by the gaslight, proved to be mere local amateurs unknown to Mr. Watkins, and they were taken down into the pantry, and there watched over by the three policemen, two gamekeepers with loaded guns, the butler, an ostler, and a carman, until the dawn allowed of their removal to Hazelhurst Police Station. Mr. Watkins was made much of in the salon. They devoted a sofa to him, and would not hear of a return to the village that night. Lady Aveling was sure he was brilliantly original, and said her idea of Turner was just such another rough, half-inebriated, deep-eyed, brave, and clever man. Someone brought up a remarkable little folding ladder that had been picked up in the shrubbery, and showed him how it was put together. They also described how wires had been found in the shrubbery, evidently placed there to trip up unwary pursuers. It was lucky he had escaped these snares. And they showed him the jewels. Mr. Watkins had the sense not to talk too much, and in any conversational difficulty fell back on his internal pains. At last he was seized with stiffness in the back and yawning. Everyone suddenly awoke to the fact that it was a shame to keep him talking after his affray. So he retired early to his room, the little red room next to Lord Aveling's suite. The dawn found a deserted easel bearing a canvas with a green inscription, "In the Hammerpond Park." And it found Hammerpond House in commotion. But if the dawn found Mr. Teddy Watkins and the Aveling diamonds, it did not communicate the information to the police. Ix a Seasley Tragedy, An Ancient Mariner's Yarn, by Percy Longhurst. Yeach may gas about torpedoes and furnal, machines and such like, but Yeach can't learn me nothing. On't I had to do with something the sort that turned the heads o' a dozen men from black to white in 'bout 10 minutes, and the Ancient Mariner looked at me with careful impressiveness. "Bad, eh?" I inquired. "She'd think it was for them poor chaps." "Didn't turn your hair white, uncle?" "Guess not." And the Ancient Mariner had a fit of chuckling that nearly choked him. When he recovered, he told me the yarn. I had heard several of old Steve's yarns, and I considered that his fine talents were miserably wasted. He ought to have been a politician or a real estate agent. This yarn, however, might very well have been true. "It was about 19 years ago," Steve commenced, "and I'd just taken up a job as cook on the Here at Last, a blamed old Noah's Ark of a windjammer from New York to Jamaica. She did the trip in about the same time as you'd walk it. She was a beauty, and th' crew 'bout fitted her. Where th' old man had gathered 'em from Lord only knows, but they was the most difficult lot I've ever sailed with, which is saying a deal considering that, man. And boy, I've been a sailor for 40 years. They was as contrary as women, and as stupid as donkeys. I couldn't do nothing right for 'em. They complained of the coffee, grumbled at the biscuit, and swore terrible at the meat. But most of all they swore at me. It all lies in the cooking, an old one-eyed chap named Barton used to say. Any cook that is worth his salt can do wonders with the worst victuals. And he told me how he'd once sailed with a cook as could make a stewed cat taste better than a rabbit. And dern me, when I went ashore next, and at great risk managed to lay hold of a big Tom and cooked it for him, hoping to please him, and went into Foxlar to dinner, and told him what I'd done, if that self-same chap, Barton, didn't hit me over head why, his tin can for trying to poison him, as he said. They complained to the old man too, which was worse, for when we got to the next port my leave ashore was stopped, and all for trying to please 'em. Rank ingratitude, I call it. Another time I tried to give the junk it really was bad, but as I hadn't bought the stores, that wasn't no fault of mine. A bit of a more pleasant flavour by biling with it, a packet of spice I found in the skipper's cabin. One of the sailors comes into my galley in a towering rage after dinner. "You blamed rascal," he said, and there was something like murder in his staring eyes. "You blamed rascal, what you been doing to our grub now?" "What's the trouble, Joe?" I asked quietly. "Trouble, ye skunk," he howls. "Our throats is hot as hell, all the skin's coming off 'em. Bill Thompson's got his lips that blistered, he can't hold his pipe between 'em. What ya been doing?" "Hold hard a jiffy," I said, and looks at what was left of the spice I'd used. I nearly had a fit. "Go away," I says, pulling myself together. "'Twain't nothing." And it wasn't nothing, but there was such an almighty run on the water barrel that arternoon old man was beginning to think a teetotal revival had struck thee here at last. But though cayenne pepper drives a chap to water pretty often while the effect lasts, it don't have no permanent result, as the old man found out. Course it was a mistake o' mine, but ain't we all liable to go a bit astray? I'm just giving ye these few examples that show ye that things wasn't altogether okay. 'Tween me and the crew, they was always swearing at me and calling of me names and having things at me head because I'd done or hadn't done soothing or other. An angel from heaven wouldn't have pleased 'em, and, as I never held much stock in the angelic trust, yea, can easily understand we was most times very much at 6s and 7s. One evening, I was sitting in folks patiently listening to the horrible language in which they reproached me because one OM had managed to break a front tooth in biting. A bit of salt pork they'd had for dinner, which was certainly no fault of mine, when one of 'em, an English chap he was, and the worst grumbler of all, suddenly cries, "Jerusalem, wouldn't I give something for a drop of beer just now? Strike me pink if I ain't a'most forgotten what the taste o' it's like." "Me too," said Harry Towers, the carpenter. "A schooner o' lager and ale, sakes. Wouldn't it just sizzle down a day like this? My aunt, I'd give a month's pay for a quart," the surly Britisher says fiercely. "A quart? Why don't ye ask for a barrel while you're about it? Then I'd help ye drink it," I says. "Yeah, you blighted, perishing idiot," he shouts. It was him that had broken his tooth. "What, waste good beer on ye, that's fit for nothing but cutting up into shark bait. That ain't the way to talk to a man as is always ready and willing to help ye," I says reproachfully. The chap glares at me like a tiger with the colic. His language was awful. "Lord help us," he finishes up with, "why, you've done nothing but try to peasen us ever since we come aboard. Ain't I right, mates?" "Right-o," they choruses, and I begin to think they'd soon be getting up to mischief. P'raps I might help you he to get some beer if you was more respectful, I says hurriedly. Beer, they all yells, and looks up at me all twonked as if I was a dime museum freak. Yes, beer, I says quietly. And where'd you be getting it from? Asks one. Never ye mind that, I answers. I've a dozen or two bottles of English stout I brought aboard, and since you're so anxious to taste a drop of beer, I don't mind letting ye have some at a price, o' course. What's the figure? Towers inquires suspiciously. He was a Michigan man. $1 the bottle. What? Shouts the man as was ready to give a month's pay for a quart. $1 the bottle. Why, you miserable old skinflint. $1 the bottle. That's the terms. Take 'em or leave 'em, says I very firmly. They talked a lot, and they swore a lot more, but finally seemed as I wasn't to be moved, and that they couldn't get the beer except at my price. The hull 10 of 'em agreed to have a bottle apiece. Money down, I stipulates, and after a lot of trouble, they collects $7 between 'em, and tells me it's all they've got, and if I didn't bring up the 10 bottles mighty quick, they'd knock me on the head and drop me overboard. Mind, I said as I goes off to the galley, money in my hand, don't ye? Let the officers see ye drinking it, or they'll think ye have been broaching cargo, and that's little short of mutiny. Bring out that beer, growls the Britisher, almost foaming at the mouth. When I came back with the 10 bottles of stout in a basket, they all looked so pleased and happy it did my heart good to look at 'em. Hand it over, they shouts impatiently. I'm afraid it's gone a bit flat, I said, as I handed the bottles round. But I've tried to pull it round. Flat or not, they weren't going to kick, and they was just about to unscrew the stoppers when the second mate suddenly shoves his head down the hatchway and yells out, "On deck, ye lazy, skulking, highly coloured lubbers. Tumble up at once and get a lively move on, or I'll be down and smarten ye up." McCloskey, the second mate, was not a fellow who stood any nonsense, and men weren't long before they was out of the forecastle, grumbling and swearing as only men who've lost their watch below can. They just stayed long enough to shove the unopened bottles of stout well out of sight underneath the mattresses of their bunks, and then they was up on deck working like niggers. A squall had struck thee. Here at last, mighty inconvenient, these squalls in the Caribbean Sea are. And here at last wasn't best, calculated to weather 'em. For 2 mortal hours everyone was hard at it, taking in sail, doubling ropes, and making all ready for what promised to be a dirty night. All thoughts o' beer was driven out of their heads. And when everything was ship-shape and they came below again, soaking wet and dog-tired, they just climbed into their berths without stopping to think of the precious bottles of stout. About 2 o'clock in the morning, I was woke up by what sounded like a pistol shot in the forecastle, and before I could rub the sleep out of my eyes, there was another, and another, and another. And I saw 4 sailors tumble out of their bunks and fall on the floor shrieking as if they'd been attacked by the most awful pain. Everyone else in the forecastle sits up, wide awake and staring at the suffering wretches on the floor. "What the hell's up?" asked the Britisher, but no one knew, and the next second there was another explosion. "Anne!" He suddenly gave a scream that lifted the hair on my scalp, and leaps out of his bunk as if he'd been suddenly prodded in a tender spot with a red-hot poker. "My God!" he screeches, the bunks exploded, and "I'm bleeding to death." And he starts yelling like a catamount, running up and down the gangway and trampling upon the 4 shrieking, cursing, praying sailors who'd been attacked first. "It's an infernal machine, and it's blowed a hole in me back," the Britisher yelled, "and we who was looking on see'd certainly hear something dripping from the bunk he'd just got out of. Ouch, I'm blowed T-bits." I'm being murdered. I'm dying, Lord help me, Harry Towers, the carpenter wails, and there was another terrific bang, and out of his bunk, Harry shot, landing on chest, or one o' the moaning, squirming sailors. The poor fellow, finding himself thus flattened out, and not knowing what it was had fallen on him, gives a gasping sort of yell, and drives Towers in the back wi' his fist. The row going on was something terrible. Asylum full o' raving lunatics on the rampage couldn't have made more noise, and them that hadn't been hurt was beginning to feel as bad as them that was, when someone scrambles down the companionway. It was McCloskey, the second mate, whose watch on deck it was. He'd heard the row, and no wonder and thinking, I say, that murder or mutiny was going on, came forward to investigate. He was a red-headed, hot-tempered Irishman, and see'd handle a crew in rare style. What the dickens, he commences, when one of the men on the floor, seeing the gun in his hand, and not recognizing him, shouted, "They're coming to finish us!" and grabs the mate round the legs with the grip of a boa constrictor. The mate, sure it was mutiny, lets off his gun promiscuous. A clip on the jaw made the sailor let go, and the mate, seeing Towers groaning on the floor quite close, kicks him hard, and asks, "What's the matter?" "We're blown up." "Sir," Towers whimpers. "Blown up, ye fool! What d'ye mean? Who's blowing ye up?" demands McCloskey. "Dunno, sir," Harry stammered. And just then there was 2 more explosions, and a couple more of the seamen bundled headlong out of their berths, uttering doleful shrieks that'd make your heart stand still. The mate was kicking, swearing, and shouting like a demon. The men all, while keeping up their row, as if they was being paid $1 a minute to yell. Then the skipper put in an appearance. His face was white as chalk, but his hands, in each o' which was a big coat, were steady as rocks, and he come down the ladder like a man who reckons he's in for a good fight. "What's all this mean, Mr. McCloskey?" he asks, pausing when he sees there's no fighting going on. Whatever the mate said was drowned by the row the sailors was making, though he bellowed like a frisky bull. The old man didn't seem a bit frightened. Dropping one of the Colts into his pocket, he roars, "Silence!" and steps over to the berth where Joe Harper, bosun, was sitting upright, stiff as a poker, and his eyes fairly starting out her, his head wi' terror. "Now then, Harper," he says, and judging by his face, the skipper was bout as mad as a bear with a sore head. "What the blazes does it mean? Have ye all gone mad?" But bosun, he was too scared to do more than gape at the skipper like a codfish 3 days out of water. An 80-year-old man gets a bit madder. "Answer, yea, damn rascal," he shouted, and he grabs Harper by the shoulder and shakes him until his teeth fairly rattled. But bosun couldn't say a word. "If this ain't enough to drive a man crazy," the skipper yells. "McCloskey, have you lost your senses like all these condemned rascals here? What's the meaning o' it?" "Don't know, sir. I heard 'em raving and screaming like lunatics, but I can't get a word out of 'em. Think they must all have become mad." And mate kicked Towers again to relieve his feelings. He'd just finished speaking when Soutine busted underneath the bosun. Harper screams, the skipper gives a jump and lets go of his arm, and Harper falls out his berth as if he'd been suddenly shot dead. Only he was making a row like a man suddenly attacked with DTs, and at that all the other miserable wretches on the floor starts worse than ever. The skipper pulls himself together, and going to the bosun's bunk, leans over and examines it. He poked about for a bit, put his fingers into a stream of southing that was falling from the bunk to the floor, and then by the light of the swinging oil lamp, I see his face turn a blazing crimson. I see him take something out of the bed and then he swings round and faces the men. "Yea, low-down thieving, chicken-hearted, blank scoundrels," he yells, and his voice was that loud and so full of passion the sailors were scared into quietness. "Yea, miserable sneaking apologies for men. So this is what's the matter, is it? By gum! If I don't have every mother's son of ye clapped into jail soon as we reach Kingstown, call me a Crimson Dutchman. Blown up, are ye? I wish to Lord some of ye had been. Sailors, ye calls yourselves. Why, by gosh, ye haven't enough spirit to rob a mouse. What's that ye say, Tawas? Infernal machines, eh? Dying? If ye don't all get a move on ye in double quick time, some of ye will be. Get out of my sight, ye blubbering babies. I'm sick, and ashamed of ye. A more sick and unhappy looking drove I never saw when men got on their legs again, and found out they weren't hurt a little bit, and discovered what it was had caused the explosions. They wouldn't look at each other, and they daren't speak, or else they'd have been fighting. I went about in fear of my life for days, but they did nothing, though if they'd known that I quite innocent of mischief, ye understand, had put a dozen grains or so of rice into every bottle, a stout amazing stuff, rice for causing fermentation in hot climates, they wouldn't have stopped short at mere profanity. My life wouldn't have been worth a moment's purchase.